Thanks, Emily. So, hey, I'm so glad to see you here today. I'm Kimberly Dark, and um, we're talking about topics today that can cause me despair, but this is the hope desk, not the despair desk. And so I'm gonna do my best to, keep it hopeful. And let's see. I just want to say the things I usually say here. I'm a writer and a sociologist and a storyteller. I have some simple answers for you about some questions on social inequality. If you have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or send them to me by social media or however it is we communicate. That's how these topics come to me, and I pick the ones that I feel like talking about this particular month. I just want to remind everybody I don't have all the answers. I don't have the only right answers, but I'll spend this time doing what I can to address a few issues because I think it is hopeful for more people to know enough about topics to at least join in civil public discourse. And so that's what we're here to do. I'm not here to offer you in-depth scholarship on these topics. In most cases, somebody else is more qualified to do that than I am. But I will always offer you a few links and things that you can look at. And I also will ask you at the end of our time together if there are places that you feel like you can discuss these topics in your own lives, because it's good to think about that. Ahead of time. Okay, so we're talking about two topics today that are so salient: abortion laws in the US and also critical race theory. So I'm going to start with critical race theory. I have to tell you, when people started talking about being against critical race theory, like that's really recent, right? That people started talking like this. And I thought I had misheard something. Like I thought that I was not understanding something, because I'm like, how, like, what, how are you even against a field of study? It's like being against anthropology, or being like, I'm against chemistry. I don't, it's like, it seems so weird to me to say that a person would be against critical race theory. And then I realized, oh, we're not actually talking about critical race theory as I understand it, as a way that the fields of law and social sciences look at systemic ways that racism influences. Maybe I'll even just say that race as a construct influences our lives. I mean, it seems so obvious to me that this is an interesting thing to study, that if we know things like, oh, right, the incarceration rate is higher for African Americans than for white folks, how might we look at that systemically rather than personally? So this is not actually, though, what folks are talking about in this current public and political discourse. So as usual, I would like to take us back a little bit so that we can find some common ground on which to discuss this. I'm curious to know, did any of you see this recent film on Billie Holiday that was out? I had a couple folks that are raising a hand. I really liked the film, but even if you didn't see that film, you might know something about her life. One of the things that was so clear in the film was how the FBI was totally after her regarding drug use. So, was it really drug use? Or was it the fact that she was singing the very popular song Strange Fruit, which is a song about lynching, which is a song about black bodies in the breeze, right? These trees bear strange fruit. So, it is very clear to us in hindsight that that's actually what the government pursuit of her drug use was about. Because listen, first of all, the federal government does not usually pursue individuals about their drug use. But also, there is a whole lot of, shall I say, tolerance for drug use in entertainment. And why so much attention would be on her for that seems peculiar, but not in hindsight. In hindsight, we know that the conversations she was raising regarding racism and specifically violence and murder against Black people, that was causing social change to occur. Just those conversations. That's how powerful conversations can be. So, talking about racism as it actually plays out and as it occurs systemically, because remember, folks, lynchings in the US were public events, they were picnics, they were announced after church. Oh, there's going to be, you know, a lynching over there, right? They were way broader than just hangings as well. They were, you know, the idea of lynching as public events where white people asserted their dominion over Black bodies. That included, you know, people being drawn and quartered. It included any kind of um, murder and abuse publicly of Black bodies. And so that, folks, is systemic, right? That is systemic when whole groups of people gather to watch such things. I mean, you can, you know, you can Google this if you'd like to. You can look and see that there were postcards made of, you know, dead bodies hanging from the trees and people around smiling because they're at a picnic. This is the level of racial terror and systemic racism that was being merely referenced in a popular song. So, this has always been problematic in the United States, to talk about racism. And if you have been paying attention to other issues of the Hope Desk, which, by the way, are available on YouTube, and maybe Emily could even share that link. I forgot all about that. I always do. You know, I've already talked about topics where, you know, we have not shaken off bias in systems like those that give people home loans or decide prison sentencing or even who's going to be pulled over for minor traffic offenses, etc. So, yes, we need to talk about racism. And there are many, primarily right wing politicians, that don't want you to do that and believe that making critical race theory, even though this is like the wrong word for this, illegal will help. And I think that the big reason that they're talking about critical race theory is to avoid simply saying we don't want racism discussed in schools. But putting this title on it means that people go like, oh my God, that sounds terrifying. Critical. It's critical, and it's about, you know, it's critical of me, and it's about being critical of my family and my values and my you know, community. So I think that that is why we've ended up with a focus on this thing that is actually, you know, I mean, nobody talks about critical race theory outside of the university that I know of, really, right? That, I mean, maybe once in a while. So, yeah, I was baffled when I first heard people talking about it like this. I want to just point out that one of the reasons that we are seeing more requests for discussions of racism and sexism in schools is that those requests are coming from students. They're asking for better curriculum. They are realizing that they are learning more online about things like the Tulsa massacre than they are learning it in school, right? And wondering what is happening here. So, for instance, there is now a statewide ethnic studies program in high schools in California. Brand new, still, you know, not the best it could be, but that stuff is happening, and largely as a result of students in high schools and universities saying, hang on, why have I not learned things that I actually need to know to function in the world? There's also this other question that I want to bring up regarding talking about racism in schools in particular, but in life, right? And this is this question about how old should kids be when they learn about racism? Um, Gosh, that's a question we could spend a, you know, a whole episode here talking about. But I would like to just put forth the idea that um, for children of color, there are studies that show that um, racism is very clearly understood by them, clocked probably earlier, but very well understood around age 6. And so I just wonder, how about then? How about age 6? Right? How about that? And there's this idea that somehow white kids should be shielded from racism in ways that children of color are not. And this is actually crippling to white children, to not understand the way the world around them functions, to not be able to fully take their place as social creators in the world around them based on true circumstances. So I think that this is an interesting question. How old should kids be when they learn about racism? Um, but I don't hear anyone asking, how old are kids when they learn about racism, when they are affected by it? So this is really interesting. And I'm going to divert for just a moment. It reminds me of a time when, in the early 90s, when I was working for a K-6 school district in Southern California. And at the time, we had a need, early 90s, to discuss HIV and AIDS. And there was a giant uproar, right? About it's an elementary school district, right? And no, you shouldn't be talking about this. And I was one of the folks that was, at the community meeting to try to help facilitate that discussion. And I mean, the fears that people had were very similar to the fears that are being discussed now. What if children learn about things that they are too innocent to know about, which really meant things that make their parents uncomfortable? So I still remember, one parent saying, but I don't want my kids knowing about like somebody who has 2 moms sitting on the sofa kissing at night. And I thought, first of all, you picked a really benign example of something that is, like, I mean, that's a weird thing to fear, like 2 women kissing on the sofa. But really what we were discussing was age appropriate messages about contagion. We weren't talking to kids about sexuality. And I think that no one wants to talk to 6-year-olds about, the details of lynching, but the ability to use age-appropriate material is totally possible. I still remember the main message of that age-appropriate AIDS prevention material. If it's warm and it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it. That was the main message of that material. I still think it's a really good public health message. All right, so critical race theory. As I started thinking about this and looking online for what kind of information is out there available, I actually found that, wow, so many people are talking about this. There are a number of short explainer videos that have come up about this. And I would like us to watch one of those short videos now. The reason that I like this one is because it actually includes Kimberly Crenshaw's brief input, and she's one of the people who first coined this term, critical race theory. She's a legal scholar, and I may have brought her into one of our previous Hope Desk episodes as well, because she also is the person who first coined the use of the term intersectionality. She has given us so much. So, Emily, is this possible?
I have to hunt around for the link because there seems to be a dash or 2 missing from.
Oh, I find that really highly unlikely that I could have made a technical error somehow in,
Yeah.
Well,
So
look, you search.
bear with me.
Yeah, you search, and I'm going to just say a few more things then. I also want to just bring up, if you don't know his work already, Ibram Kendi is a person who's written a few books about racism in America. Stamped from the Beginning is a really good one. And so is, gosh, what is it? How to Be an Anti-Racist? Maybe that's the title of it. Now I feel bad for bringing it up and not knowing the exact title of the book. But Ibram Kendi, you can certainly look up his work, and he suggests that white folks should ask themselves when we're talking about these, broader conversations about race, which is really what this is about. That white folks should ask themselves questions like, why is there a growing racial gap, wealth gap in this country? Why are Black people disproportionately getting COVID-19, for instance? Why are Black people being shot unarmed when white armed criminals are being peacefully arrested? So these are just basic questions that show patterns of behavior and patterns of impact in the United States. And so if the answer, when one asks oneself these questions, is that there is something wrong with Black people, then that is a person that needs to understand how race works systemically. I mean, this seems like a very simple litmus, and it is specifically what what these lawmakers are trying to keep us from asking of ourselves by trying to ban critical race theory. Yeah, I think there's something else really important that Ibram Kendi points out, which is how we eliminate racism is by eliminating racist policies, right? Racial inequity, racial injustice. And this is something that he argues strongly in the book Stamped from the Beginning, that we can change policies, we can change people in power. Change is actually possible if we fight for it and stop looking at this as though it is somehow an individual problem, rather than a problem with greed, laws, policies, these kinds of things. How are we doing, Emily? Oh, you're muted.
How am I doing today? Not so great. Is it this video that begins? Let me share my screen, and maybe you can see by the thumbnail if I found the correct video. Okay, Kimberly?
Okay.
All
Got
right,
it.
so I'm going share screen, and I'll go here, and I'll go here, and I'll go here. Does this look like the right
Correct.
guy? Okay, so I'll go full screen, and I'm going to share now.
Thank you.
Okay, here we go.
Can you tell me what critical race theory is?
No. Critical race theory?
Critical race theory.
No.
I don't know. I can guess.
Guessing or not, across the country, a number of politicians are getting it wrong.
Critical race theory is a Marxist doctrine that rejects the vision of Martin Luther King Jr.
Absolutely false.
It's basically teaching kids to hate our country and to hate each other based on race.
False and slanderous.
Meet professor and scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. Crenshaw is one of the founders of critical race theory, which she helped develop in the late 1980s. In short, critical race theory is an approach based on the idea that the history of white supremacy still has a very real and lasting impact on our society and institutions today.
Critical race theory just says, let's pay attention to what has happened in this country and how what has happened in this country is continuing to create differential outcomes so we can become that country that we say we are. So critical race theory is not anti-patriotic. In fact, it is more patriotic than those who are opposed to it because we believe in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment. We believe in the promises of equality, and we know we can't get there if we can't confront and talk honestly about inequality.
Critical race theory is not a doctrine. It's not a manuscript. One way of describing it is looking with a critical eye at race and institutions. Let's take an example from history. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. A critical race theorist would note that slavery persisted for almost 100 years after those words were written, and it was more than a century before women got the right to vote. So why is the term causing such a stir in conservative political circles today?
This left-wing nonsense that suggests that any race is inherently inferior or racist or oppressive.
Opponents are concerned critical race theory is or will be forced on students. Supporters say that critical race theory is not based on the view of this race is good, this race is bad. Supporters also say in the wake of protests and calls for racial equality in the past year, those unnerved by it are now using critical race theory as a catch-all term for everything related to race, politics, and education in this country. So says Princeton professor Imani Perry.
I think this is the sort of post-Trump era way of inciting anxiety, fear, and actually trying to sort of elicit a hostility towards the progress that I think we've begun to make in just the last couple of months.
To date, at least 8 states have taken steps to ban topics surrounding critical race theory without naming it, including Oklahoma.
We cannot revert to 100-year-old thinking that a person is any less valuable or inherently racist by the color of their skin.
To be clear, critical race theory does not say someone is racist because of the color of their skin. And it does not say anyone should be ashamed of themselves because of the color of their skin.
Still, some parents who hear the term are speaking out at school board meetings.
Just because I do not want critical race theory taught to my children in school does not mean that I'm a racist, damn it.
But Crenshaw says the theory is not about calling individuals racist, but looking at racism still ingrained in American institutions. And she says we have to talk about it.
If this censoring of all conversation about racism is called racism. That's what this move is really about. It's really not about a theory. It's really not about what's in people's hearts. It's about an effort to shut down all conversation about the sources and the reproduction of racial inequality.
Jason Carroll, CNN, New York.
Thanks, Emily. So I thought that this was a really good framing of the whole back and forth discourse here. And I just want to point out one more thing before I ask if you have questions about this. And that is, please notice how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a criminal and also sought by the FBI during the time of his life, who has now become an acceptable beacon for civil rights, is being co-opted in these conversations by saying, oh, he would hate critical race theory. Listen, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And also evidence that these folks have not read Dr. King's work. Does anyone have questions or comments that they would like to make about critical race theory or anything that I've said so far that the video has talked about?
I have a question.
Yes.
What was the catalyst for this phrase to enter the CNNs of it all recently?
Yeah. You know, I was trying. Look, I think that it is on the news because these states are creating laws now against teaching critical race theory. But what I was actually looking for was, how on earth did this this way of studying a part of history and society and law, how did that get picked up by politicians and somehow vilified? And I don't know the answer to that. I couldn't find clues for that online. And my best estimate, as I've already mentioned, is that it has to do with somebody trying to figure out, strategizing, how do we get people to stop talking about racism in the wake of successful efforts from Black Lives Matter and other movements for racial justice. And somebody landed on critical race theory as sounding scary, right? Look, I have described, I teach in a sociology department at Cal State San Marcos, and I would describe our department as having a critical race theory approach because there are a lot of scholars in our department that are interested in the history and current social patterning of racism. That's it. That's really what we're talking about here. Folks who are interested in social science and history and law should be interested in race. And also, we should be, which is part of what I do with my professional life, we should be finding ways to bring social science messages to broader groups of people. And that is the I think the fear here is that somehow what is discussed in critical race theory in scholarship is going to be more broadly discussed in public life. And by golly, that is exactly what I'm hoping that you do, that each of us figures out how to discuss these things better in public life. Other questions or comments about critical race theory right now? Because, I mean, we still have to talk about abortion laws, and goodness knows that is such a fun topic. So I'm going to move on right now. And of course, we can talk about critical race theory some more in a little while if it pleases you to do so. Okay. How do I quickly frame this issue? I commented on abortion laws in the United States because, well, we're going to talk a little bit about abortion itself, but that is a whole different conversation. So let me just again go back in history in order to give us a little bit of perspective. So throughout history, in different countries, in different places, abortion has been legal or either legal or not regulated, mostly, right? It has always been needed and employed by women as a form of family planning. So let's be clear about this, right? That the idea that I have become pregnant and there is no way that I can feed or care for this child and I would like to end the pregnancy, that has been a human need for time immemorial. We are in a situation right now where there are a lot of very reliable birth control methods that our nation actually withholds from its populace. So the fact that we are still living in a country where first of all, where healthcare is not universally provided, but also where even businesses who provide healthcare can decide to exclude birth control from the services they provide. I mean, that is so retrograde that it's hard to even, wrap your head around. So, yes, of course, we do have better methods of family planning now than, hundreds of years ago. But abortion is still something that has always been employed and used and always will be, whether or not it is safe, whether or not it is legal. I think this is an important thing to understand because making abortion illegal has not ever stopped people from getting abortions. Never, not once, right? Like, it complicates it and it might keep individuals from doing it, but overall, it has not stopped the practice. All right, we have in the United States a hodgepodge of state-by-state laws, but overall, Roe versus Wade in 1973, a Supreme Court case, protects a woman's liberty to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. Now, what's the first thing you notice about this language? That it is a little bit needing interpretation, right? Like, what is excessive regulation? There's a lot of language here that needs interpretation. And I want to point this out to you because how we frame these topics really matters. So at first, when Roe v. Wade was, became law, there was this issue of the balance of a woman's privacy, what she chooses to do with her health, and also the reasonable protections that the government needs to give its citizenry. So how they framed that balance in the beginning had to do with trimesters, right? Y'all know, right, that this is how medically basic sections of the pregnancy are measured. So, first trimester abortion, yes, all good. No one should interfere with the woman's privacy and her relationship to her health care. In trimester 2, governments can require health regulations. And in trimester 3, it is possible for a state to prohibit an abortion, but only if they keep safeguards in place for the life of the mother. So that's how things rolled along until 1992. And, this was also an era in which second trimester abortion, third trimester abortion was just off the table in a number of states. Second trimester abortion was like molded into, all kinds of issues that some of which pertain to abortion and people, some of them kind of don't. But this third trimester is when things get tricky. So in 1992, the 3-trimester plan was abandoned in favor of fetal viability, because of course times are changing, and it became possible for a fetus to be viable outside of the womb as a person, earlier than it used to be. The other thing that happened with that 1992 ruling, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, I believe, was that the strict scrutiny standard was also overturned. So this was actually, a loss in abortion rights. So I want to just point out that with regard to all of these laws that are so varied all over the nation, there is an overall desire to have abortion be available to women who need it in our nation. And I believe that there is no way to enact this will of the majority with the current framing that we have on this topic. So again, framing is very important. Yeah. So if you are framing abortion, the access to abortion, as a moral issue, first of all, it becomes intractable because it becomes a thing that people simply take sides on, and they're not going to budge at all, ever. But there are actually other ways to look at this abortion, this issue. Financially is one of them. With regard to bodily autonomy is another one of them. There are different ways to frame this topic. So it's important to recognize that many of the laws that are in place right now to restrict abortion have really gone through the side door. And this is also another thing that, I'm not sure why courts are allowing that, right? I mean, things like unnecessary standards related to the facility in which, abortion is taking place. There has been a huge limiting of abortions by saying, well, okay, we can have it, but the doctor has to, be insured and connected to that facility in a very certain way. That doesn't apply to anything else that doctor might do in that facility. Unnecessary standards relating to equipment or staffing or time in between certain notifications, again, that don't exist with other health care procedures. So this is important to understand, that there are many technicalities that where folks are trying to say, oh, yeah, okay, it may be legal, but we're going to restrict access to it by doing this and this. Now, what I'm saying right now is not a matter of my opinion. These are well-known strategies, and the folks employing them are literally saying, okay, if we can't restrict it this way, we're going to restrict it this way or this way or this way, because we are morally superior on this topic. This is why I'm saying that the topic, the way that it is framed, is very important regarding how things go. So I would love for Emily to share the link that is reproductiverights.org. So the specific link that I'm giving you is answering the question, what if Roe v. Wade fell, right? Because it's being revisited by the Supreme Court. And of course, this is a Supreme Court that is not expected to be to act favorably, right, toward this form of healthcare, this form of bodily autonomy. So let me just say something too about the Supreme Court. We very much in the United States like the idea of neutrality, that it is possible for people to be neutral, objective on certain topics. And we hold judges very much to this standard. Of course, we know based on how the fights over, when Mitch McConnell says, no, we're not going to let this president choose the next Supreme Court justice. It's because those are not neutral. No human is neutral. No human is completely objective. So just the idea about neutrality needs revision in our culture. But which things the Supreme Court even decides to hear is already a political decision. So for instance, some of you know that I have written about abortion with regard to bodily autonomy. We already have bodily autonomy laws in place in the United States that say you do not have to use your body in order to save another human being's life. So if you and I are in a car accident and I am going to bleed out without your blood transfusion and we're a match, I am obviously a fully viable human in the world, but you can let me die by withholding a little blood transfusion. Now, we all know that a blood transfusion is far less invasive than being forced to carry a pregnancy full term. And yet, somehow, bodily autonomy is not extended to women in the same way that it is extended to men in our current nation. So this is another example of how framing the issue is super important. I know I'm giving you a lot of links today, but Emily, the last 2 links that I sent you today, one of them is one of my articles about this topic, and the other is from Gabrielle, what's her name? Anyway, she's pointing out the role of sperm in pregnancy, right? So we have a current framing of abortion as a moral and religious issue. And I would like it if more folks could have the conversation about how else this topic could be framed. Because regardless of what you believe, it is healthy for discussion and debate to look at various framings of an issue. I also believe that abortion is, that we should be bodily autonomy. There's good reasons we have that, and it should be extended to every human, not just men. So that is clearly my position, but there are lots of ways to look at this. One of them really has to do with, is the issue stopping abortion and good family planning and having enough resources for the children that are born? We know that limiting access to abortion also goes along with limiting access to birth control. Those are the same politicians and policies that are, moving in both of those directions. And so it actually increases the number of unwanted pregnancies. So I would love for a few things to happen if we think about shifting the conversation. One of them is to start thinking about how conversations have shifted on other topics that have been, big shifts. Recently, marriage equality is one of them, right? Think about that. We went from criminalization of homosexuality to marriage equality over a period of 5 decades, 4 decades. And so there was not great support for the idea that gay people should marry. And then over time, there was. This is what has happened with abortion as a form of healthcare as well, that, there is now a majority of folks that are in favor of that. And it has been legal since 1973. And yet fringe elements are saying no because of moral and religious issues. So we need to think in terms of those broader ways of framing. Also, I think we need a lot more folks who don't have an obvious stake in abortion discussing it. So, for instance, I I'm recently on TikTok, by the way. That's a long story, but I'm on there, and so I'm making these little videos. And I made a series of little videos about abortion recently, and one of them was in response to some things that were said about a previous one, where people were saying, well, you just got to keep your legs closed and this won't be a problem. Well, you're just going to have to cope with it now because it's going to be illegal again. And, I'm one of the videos I made was saying, look, let me just make something completely clear. I am a postmenopausal dyke. I am not looking to have an abortion. Like, this is not like you are not personally punishing me, but the tone of those comments really points to the fact that this is not about children. It's not about somehow making life better for children. It is about punishing women. And we could go further there, but look, we need more folks without an obvious stake in this to discuss it. We also need to discuss the economics more often and increase the access to birth control at the same time. But the economics are really clear that it is not a good idea for people who are already poor to have children when they don't want them. Of course, not everybody who's seeking an abortion is poor. That is not what I mean to say. But the economic ramifications of the latter, or of the former, are very important. Also, we need to research about what actually works and look at other countries as models. Look at like what happens, right, when there is access to education about sexuality and children are treated like full people who have to become decision makers about their bodies. The Netherlands offers us some fabulous examples. If you're not already familiar with some research on teenage sexuality in the United States from Peggy Orenstein, I would recommend her books, Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex. And she brings up the example of the Netherlands. There are lots of places where you can look at these examples too. You know what happens when kids are treated as though they are full human beings that need to make complex decisions in their lives, and they have access to birth control, and their parents talk to them about sex? Wow, what do you know? The onset of sexual activity is actually significantly delayed, and abortion is super duper low. So these are things that actually work in other places and could work here as well. So some other ways to frame the conversation away from morality and religion might be bodily autonomy that I already mentioned, might be male responsibility for sperm, because listen, I hate to be gross about this, but sperm on your toe, you're not getting pregnant. Sperm on your forehead, you're not getting pregnant. There is really only one place that sperm needs to stay away from, and that is the womb. And so there are a lot of people who have a lot of kinds of sex that don't cause pregnancy. But until we can discuss sex and sexuality in these kinds of frank and functional ways, there's going to be a whole lot of nonsense about, well, she needs to keep her legs closed. No, she doesn't. She needs to have sex that doesn't have sperm getting anywhere near her womb. That's what needs to happen. So separation of church and state is also another really great conversation that we could be having. Economic, also support of children with life cycle specific education about their bodies, but also about communication and decision making. We could focus conversations there. Also, abortion is a part of healthcare for people with wombs. We also could talk more, as many have done, about the heartbeat not being a viable sign of life. I actually personally don't love that as a path to go down, because I think there is something a bit mystical and ineffable about when life begins. I don't know for sure myself, but I do know from having been pregnant that at some point there was a human being there inside of me. At some point that was true. I also know that anyone who chooses from being pregnant, that anyone who chooses to end a pregnancy deserves support and care, not derision. We also need to focus on stronger penalties for rape, because with rape being so prevalent in the United States, the conversation about who gets to have access to abortion services becomes, well, absurd and also definitely punitive towards women's autonomy. I want to just point out to you that thing, the website about reproductive rights and what if Roe fell. Please do scroll down on that page and look at the glossary of terms, because that is going to be the quickest education on the laws and terms that have, affected this issue in recent American history, so that you can have more confident discussions about, well, what does the first trimester mean? Or what is the Hyde Act? Or, there's so much that I didn't discuss here, but much of it is quickly explained there.